had to leave to pay the meter, I guess. Could you explain in that poem what the last part, how it works out? I don't forget the damage done to your Chelek Elohim.
Chelek Elohim is Hasidic terminology. It's Hasidic Hebrew for the piece of God in you, the piece of divinity in you. There's a notion that in each of us is a Chelek Elohim, a little spark of godliness. And there's a sense that when one sins, when one acts wrongly, one tarnishes that Chelek Elohim or obscures it in some way. And it seems to me that when I wrote this poem, it's on the one hand about the historical account of dispossessing the original inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites of old. But it was meant to resonate with the contemporary situation of refugee camps and checkpoints and some of the ways in which Palestinians live or are forced to live. And I think that enforcing that can do damage to the souls of those who are called to enforce it.
It seems that there's always this downside to any kind of militarization of society. And especially when we as a society call our young people to act on our behalf, when they're still growing psychologically and emotionally, and we ask them to do things in our name, it has an effect, and it has an effect that lasts for all of their life.
One of the most interesting things for me about the book of Genesis is the ways in which family trauma ripples through the generations. Abraham has 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. There's some family discord and they go their separate ways. Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. There's some family discord and they go their separate ways. There's a way in which I can see this kind of painful family dynamic playing itself out over and over again. And I think that's some of what happens to us in terms of the bigger human family, certainly in terms of the Middle East, that there are generations of family trauma that keeps being played out.
In the same poem at the end, could you talk a bit about your choice of the word interrogation?
I read a very powerful novel when I was living in Jerusalem by Edith Ravel, and at this moment I can't remember its name, and I'll have to Google. Well, if you Google for a novel by Edith Ravel, she only has a few of them, and it will become clear which one it is that I mean. I'm sorry.
What is the spelling of the name?
The name is Edith, E-D-E-E-T, Ravel, R-A-V-E-L. She's Israeli by birth, but I believe lives somewhere in Canada now. I've forgotten where. And one of the main characters of the novel is an Israeli soldier who works as an interrogator. And part of the power of the novel is that this man is a very human and very real character, and his moral dilemmas are very alive. The book is told from the point of view of I think a young Canadian woman who's hitchhiking in Israel and is picked up by this guy and they fall in love. And so she marries this guy and then discovers that he works as an interrogator. And interrogation doesn't always just mean sitting down opposite someone and asking them some harsh questions. And the novel really wrestles with the tough ethical questions of torture, and those are also certainly still live for us today. I mean, in the States, this is a tremendous debate right now, whether the use of torture in terms of interrogating suspects is ever justified or justifiable, and does it work? And so I had all of that in the back of my mind when I was writing this poem. Do I have any evidence that the ancient Israelites tortured the ancient Canaanites? No. But when I read the story of the conquest of the land through the lens of the conflict in the land today, that's one of the things that bubbles up for me.
But the choice of the word interrogation, I mean,
It's a bit loaded.
Well, it's also, you could have used something stronger if you were wanting to talk about torture.
That's
whereas
true.
Interrogation
It could
is
go either.
open to.
And that may be some of my own ambivalence showing through. I always want, on the one hand, to be calling Israel to the high moral standard that I yearn for, and on the other hand, I want to be protecting the parts of it that I love from harm. And it's a complicated balancing act. I know that the poems I've written that deal with Israel are always too gentle for some of my readers and too harsh for others, and I tend to feel like if I can be evoking both of those responses, I must be doing it right.
But it's got to be hard. And I mean, you haven't talked at all. I haven't asked you to talk at all about just being a poet and a rabbi. And you have such a strong voice as a poet. I think I'm not sure these 5 poems are necessarily typical of the book.
I think now that I think on it, we picked a couple of the ones we thought might touch on really challenging pieces, the vengeful God piece and the Israel and Palestine piece and the sexism and gender stuff in Leviticus. The book does have more humor and whimsy and lightness. I promise that it's not all this dark all the way through. As I think the Hebrew Bible has some whimsy and some lightness. It has a talking donkey. True facts, talking donkey. A lot of people don't believe me about that. That seems to be not one of the Bible stories they grew up with.
I got to read that one in the evening service one time, and I'd never read it before.
It's a great
Did
story.
you laugh from the
Believe
pulpit?
it. No, but I think the disbelief came from my mouth.
That made it a wonderful reading.
It's a wonderful story.
I guess we all have our favorite stories. I don't know if you've written a poem on it, but my favorite book of the Hebrew Scriptures is Jonah.
It's funny. At last night's reading, I got a request for Jonah as well. There must be something in the air. I've written sermons about Jonah, but I haven't written a Jonah poem, and I should, or a Jonah cycle of poems.
I think
It's
a
so
cycle.
rich.
A cycle.
You're right. Well, maybe that'll be this year's Yom Kippur sermon. Actually,
Any other-
are there? That's another. If anyone has a favorite Bible story, favorite moment, if there's a poem that goes with that favorite moment.
Do you have another you'd like to read as a closing?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Have you ever thought of arguing that Eve only disobeyed her husband, not God, because she wasn't created when God gave the order?
That's a fascinating argument.
That's a good one.
Yeah, boy, I mean that one story alone has sparked volumes of libraries of literature, and it's an extraordinary story. Let's see, what would be one? Actually, maybe in having mentioned the talking donkey, maybe I'll read my talking donkey poem. That'll be our closing. It's not actually a talking donkey poem, but it comes out of the talking donkey story, which is Parashat Balak. And just as a reminder for those who may not recall, there's the story of a non-Israelite king hires a non-Israelite prophet to curse the children of Israel because he sees them all encamped and he wants them gone, this plague from his land. And ultimately, the prophet comes and says, I'll do it, but I can only say what God will tell me to say. And he says, fine, go, curse them. And when he opens his mouth, what actually comes out is, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. And the king is furious. That's not what he wanted at all. And that's a verse that we often sing at the beginning of services. But before he gets to the mountaintop to offer the curse that turns into a blessing, he's going with his donkey on this mission, and the donkey balks because the donkey sees an angel standing in the road with a flaming sword. And the guy doesn't see the angel, so he whacks the donkey with a stick. So the donkey keeps going, he balks. 3 times the donkey balks, and he whacks him with a stick. And finally, then the Lord opened the ass's mouth, and she said to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you have beaten me these 3 times?" This poem is called Sandals. If God gave voice to my worn Birkenstocks, they would cry out, "What did we ever do to you, that you chose to traverse these dusty sidewalks and stand in the meltwater from the ice shavings, packed around fish you can't even name? I might not hear them above the clatter of wheels and the honking of horns, the rise and fall of voices negotiating pita and cucumbers, parsley and eggplants, and the man who repeats, 'Ice coffee, chamesh shekalim,' until my mouth feels so dry I reach in my pocket and buy myself a blessing for the road." I wish all of you a blessing for the road. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.